Well, good evening, everyone. Michael, soothing here. I went to play in my local poker tournament this evening and noticed all the flags that were lining the driveway going up to the casino. They put them out on certain days. Then I remembered it was December 7th. December 7th. Pearl Harbor Day. A day which shall live in infamy. Be quiet, squeaky chair. And so I just thought I would do a little retrospective, since the vast majority of you are unaware of the history of the surprise attack that dragged the USA into World War II. We didn't really want to be in World War II. The UK was fighting against Germany and its expansion throughout Northern Europe, and they were kind of isolated and on their own. Once the Netherlands fell and France fell and Italy aligned against the European powers, Belgium, Holland, Denmark, all of the major countries, Czechoslovakia, Poland, they were all falling to the expansion of Germany. Meanwhile, Japan was attacking and taking over Southeast Asia, and they had already attacked China and I believe Malaysia. So they had designs on getting pretty much all of Asia. And the U.S. was didn't want to get dragged into the whole conflict. So we started sending aid to China and weapons to help fight the Japan invasion and cut off supplies to Japan. So they decided maybe they would plan a sneak attack and see if they could preemptively take out our naval fleet in Hawaii, most of which was in Honolulu, right? So what happened? Well, cleverly, they went to Admiral Yamamoto and said, give us a plan for how we can take out the U.S. Navy so they won't be a threat and the U.S. won't go to war with us. And Yamamoto, the U.S. expected the Japanese to attack our bases in the Philippines and elsewhere if it came down to going to war. They never expected they'd attack Hawaii because it was thought to be too far away, too much refueling involved for a large fleet, and for a variety of other reasons, we thought we were safe there with our fleet in Pearl Harbor. So Japan cleverly devised a strategy and launched a fleet a couple weeks in advance, in secret under cover of darkness. 6 aircraft carriers, which were carrying, I believe, somewhere around 500 and something planes. And I might forget all the details, so I'm going to look at my notes for a minute. Also, our naval intelligence believed that Japan could not carry out a torpedo attack in Pearl Harbor because it's fairly shallow, and dropping a torpedo from a plane, it would have to run deep. But the Japanese had cleverly modified all their torpedoes with big fins and things on the back and stabilizers that would cause the torpedoes, once they hit the water, to run shallow, to quickly go shallow and run at a depth that would allow the ships to be attacked. This was a big surprise and shock to our fleet. So, unprepared, not even expecting such a thing, on a Sunday morning, 78 years ago, December 7th, before 8 a.m., just a little before, the Japanese carried out their attack. They launched 2 waves of planes. The first wave was how many planes? It was in excess of 300. Let me see if I wrote it down. I can't recall. I think it was, 360 planes, I believe, in the first wave. And they had a combination of torpedoes and dive bombers. They came in first with the torpedo planes because they're much slower, and they had the element of surprise on their side, so they could get away with launching all the torpedoes before they would be shot out of the sky by our own aircraft or anti-aircraft fire. So many of them got their torpedoes off, and many more launched armor-piercing or dropped armor-piercing bombs. Some of those were in the second wave. The second wave of planes, 171, were mostly dive bombers. Now, the attack on the ships they attacked was very successful. They either sunk or damaged all 8 of the big battleships that were in Pearl Harbor in our Navy, and they also sunk a large number of other ships. 18 ships altogether were either sunk or ran aground with damage. We sustained a total of 2,403 casualties, and about half that number, again, in wounded. And so the whole attack was only 90 minutes long, but they did achieve the element of surprise, and they attacked a number of other targets. The U.S. commanders, because they were unprepared, they also made did certain stupid things. They had the ships tethered next to each other in the harbor. So, like when the USS, the biggest problem was, or the most casualties, the worst hit, was a direct hit by an armor-piercing shell on the USS Arizona, which blew up the forward magazine in the ship. When I say magazine, I don't mean the kind you read, okay? I don't mean this magazine. I mean that's where they store all the bombs and shells, and the shells that are explosive that they launch from the big naval guns, that point up. All that kind of thing. All the munitions were stored there, and all of that blew up at once. And that accounted for about half the casualties that day amongst the military naval personnel. And the Arizona was sunk and remains there to this day as a memorial. You can tour it on top of it and see it there in Pearl Harbor if you visit Hawaii. So, another stupid thing that the U.S. commanders did was, at the airfields where all of our aircraft were, I think it was Wheeler Field and Hickam Field, they were afraid of sabotage by Japanese that might be living in Hawaii. So instead of having the aircraft all spread out at their airfield, they had them all bunched together in the center of the airfield, where it would be easy for a couple of sentries to walk around and monitor and make sure there was no sabotage. But of course that made them a very easy target for the planes that came in and attacked the airfields and blew all of those planes up with bombs. How many aircraft did we lose that day? We lost, let me find it. It was a lot. Maybe I didn't write that number down, but it was well over 100, I know that, aircraft that we lost. The Japanese only lost 29 planes in the entire 2 waves of attacks. And there were 2 things, however, that went badly that day for the Japanese as far as the future is concerned. The first is that a lot of the more junior officers in the Japanese Navy insisted that they should go in for a 3rd wave of attacks, rearm the planes, and go back and destroy all of the infrastructure, the naval shipyards, all of the fuel depots and things, all of the big tanks where all the fuel was stored, all of that kind of thing. And Admiral Nagumo, with the consent of who was the one who planned the attack again, Yamamoto, decided not to go in and do a 3rd wave of attacks because the anti-aircraft gunners were getting a little bit better after the 2nd wave, and they didn't want to lose a lot of planes so early in the war. However, that was a tactical and strategic mistake, because had they gone back for a 3rd wave of attacks, they would have blown up a lot of that, all the fuel depots, all the shipyards and things, and it would have been far more difficult for the U.S. Navy to rebound. And so it would have taken, it's estimated, perhaps a year to get everything back in order and get a lot of ships repaired and active again, had that occurred. But instead they didn't go back for that 3rd attack, and most of the ships were brought back to operational status very quickly. Of the 8 battleships, for example, 6 of them were repaired and did additional service back in the war, some of which was devastating to Japan in future battles, such as the Battle of Leyte Gulf, for example, or the Battle of Midway. So anyway, the second key thing that was a problem was the Japanese had expected the U.S. aircraft carriers to be on station in Pearl Harbor, but they were all out to sea. So they were very disappointed that they weren't able to damage and destroy those. That allowed us to mount counterattacks and bring the U.S. Navy into the conflict much sooner and much more effectively than would have otherwise occurred. Admiral Yamamoto was actually against this attack, this surprise attack, because he had studied in the U.S. You see, I'm still working on my cube, my blockhead thing here. He had studied in the U.S. and he knew what the U.S. was capable of when it comes to resolve resources and manufacturing. He knew we were going to mount a huge war effort, whereas his superiors in Japan thought the U.S. would just fold after this attack, rather than the whole country coming together and saying, we're not going to stand for this, we're going to go defeat Japan. Interestingly, the day after the attack, Germany declared war on the USA which was a huge mistake on the part of Adolf Hitler, because that brought us into the war in Europe as well. And without the US there, pretty much all of Europe was destined to fall to that dictator, and we would all be Nazis today. All right. So the US had to essentially be at war within one day against two superpowers. Very difficult. But Yamamoto was against it because he knew how we were going to respond, but he was tasked by his superiors, and so as a good, essentially, admiral, he decided to craft the best attack he could. And he's known for famously saying afterward, when they were congratulating him on the success of the attack, he said, "I fear that all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." And in fact, that was the truth. If you know the rest of your World War II history, it ultimately ended with, hopefully, the only time in history that there'll be a use of atomic weapons. And those were dropped against Japan when it became clear that they would fight a suicide battle to the very last man on their home turf and cost 500,000 or more US lives if we had to invade to finish off the war. So anyway, the reason I'm bringing it up today, of course, is because it's Pearl Harbor Day, and the old guys that served at that time are almost all gone. The old men of Pearl Harbor. Here's one of them. It says 15 survivors are anticipated to attend the annual ceremonies this weekend in Hawaii, including naval veteran John Schleier, 93-year-old Nokomis resident. Let's see. Let me see now. A lot of these guys are dying off. Local Pearl Harbor veteran story lives on. Here's a guy that served on the USS Detroit, one of the battleships. Call to Duty series, 130 local World War II veterans. Sam Fryefield of Eugene was the lone featured veteran who was at Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, on the USS Detroit, which was not damaged in the attack, which is how he survived. Most of these guys have passed away. Let's see what else they say about it. Turn to page A8. Here we are, A8. It talks about some of these guys that are in their 90s now, the ones that survived. I mean, my father was he born yet? Yeah, he was born, but he was just a little kid at the time of the attack. Here's a guy that's 97 here, survived the attack. He was in church that Sunday morning. See, if you went to church Sunday morning, you wouldn't have been killed. So, remember that next time you're reluctant to go to church. But, okay, I don't want to make light of it because a lot of these guys, so many of them were heroes. There were some that ran out and manned anti-aircraft guns and machine guns and did their best to ward off the attack under withering fire. There's a couple of good movies that have been made. The one with Charlton Heston, and a bunch of other guys. Oh wait, that was the Battle of Midway, so I have to rethink that. But anyway, there was a remake called Pearl Harbor. Some of the other mistakes the US made, for example, we had an early version of a radar to pick up planes in an attack that was active at the time, and they picked up the incoming flight of Japanese fighter bomber torpedo planes, the huge wave of them, and the guys at the radar station alerted command headquarters on that early Sunday morning, and those guys just ignored it and said, oh, it's probably some US planes coming from the mainland, right? You know, they could have been prepared otherwise and been ready to counterattack, to ward off. The very next day, of course, our president at the time, who ushered us out of the Great Depression, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who, by the way, was crippled and in a wheelchair, but would never show himself sitting in it in the press. They would always show him only from the torso up, to show strength. Anyway, he gave the famous speech, where he says the next morning, December 7th, a day which shall live in infamy, that we were attacked. I wonder if I have the text of that speech somewhere in these articles. Even our local paper has an article about Pearl Harbor. Here, Uncle Sam throwing a wreath into the water. Today our Americans are remembering the sacrifice made by the 2,403 servicemen killed in the attack on Pearl Harbor some 78 years ago. Our local reporter is really, really bad. He never gets his facts right, and his political opinions are always wrong also. So he starts off right off the bat. I just am going to mention because, I'm an engineer, so I'm anal about these things, getting the facts right. Anyway, he says 2,403 servicemen were killed. Actually, that's not the case. That number includes a large number of civilians and others that were killed. Of the servicemen, there were 2,008 killed and 710 wounded, just to, get our facts right. But anyway, he says, last year's remembrance marked another occasion. It was the first time a USS Arizona survivor was not present for the 7:50 a.m. commemoration of the more than 900 servicemen who remain entombed in that battleship. That Arizona sunk so fast the guys couldn't get off of it, and so it sunk, and all the guys inside were essentially trapped and died there, and that's become the memorial, and there's a ceremony there every year, and unfortunately there's virtually no one left. I think there's one guy left from the Arizona. Let's see, no, there's three. All told, only 3 crew members from that morning attack remain alive today, as the few remaining voices from that horrific day of infamy grow quiet. This is why I'm making this video, because I think we deserve to be remembered. This is what ushered us into World War II, to the great relief of Winston Churchill in the UK because he desperately needed us as an ally. England was just fighting a furious battle for their lives in the Battle of Britain, which was a big air battle we'll talk about sometime. And they were doing a fantastic job, but they needed the military might and manufacturing capability of the USA to also come alongside and fight with them side by side, which we then did after the Pearl Harbor attack. So in a way, the attack ended up saving all of Europe as well as all of Southeast Asia and China from an imperial dictatorship, which they would have had to live under otherwise. And by the way, the Japanese were brutal. When they attacked a country, they didn't abide by any of the normal conventions of war. Like if you read about the rape of Nanking, for example, big city in China where they killed some 500,000 or something civilians just for the heck of it, raped women and killed children and things just for fun. It was a pretty brutal thing. So I'm trying to see if they have the anything about the speech that President Roosevelt gave at the time. Oh, I'm looking in the wrong papers. I hope all this wrestling will be a little bit relaxing at least. A8. Let's see what we can find. Maybe there's a snippet of the speech. Let's see if we can find it. No, I don't see it so far. Maybe I'll find something here. Bear with me. I'll give you a little snippet of one of the recollections of one of the guys. During the surprise attack, this one guy says, some like Vernon Olson of Port Charlotte were wait. Oh, the other thing I was going to mention is that Japan launched this attack without any declaration of war, which made the U.S. furious because you're supposed to declare war first, then attack. And essentially their declaration of war memo came through an hour after the attack, and their formal declaration of war was the next day or something like that. So by then the future was a done deal as far as full-out war. Here's this one guy's recollection. Sam Fryfield, this guy here. Let's see. Fryfield headed for breakfast. Let's see. I was topside at the rear rail, and I heard an explosion aft, says Fryfield, now 89. At that time, he was a 19-year-old storekeeper, third class. Storekeeper on the ship. Like, in charge of all the goods and so forth. I looked back and debris was hurtling down from the explosion of a ship which was docked on the other side of Ford Island from us. It all happened so fast, context was impossible. And then Fryfield sighed. A plane dropped a torpedo, and I saw the meatball insignia on the plane. That's the big red circle that was on the Japanese planes, the Zeros and all the other types of planes. That I don't think they had Zeros in this attack. There were other types. Says Fryfield, who grew up in Los Angeles, suddenly where we were headed for our battle stations, America was at war. The Detroit battleship wasn't damaged, but the attack damaged, or the Detroit cruiser, but the attack damaged all 8 U.S. Navy battleships, 4 of which were sunk. The Japanese also sank or damaged 3 cruisers, 3 destroyers, an anti-aircraft training ship, and a mine layer. When the roughly 2-hour attack was over, 2,402 Americans had been killed and 1,282 wounded. The Detroit put out to sea quickly to lessen the chances of being hit. Fryfield saw little of the carnage after that, but the memories of that day will never leave him. Let's see if there's anything here about Roosevelt's speech. Well, you can look it up if you're curious. But let's see, there was something else I was going to mention. Maybe we'll talk about an entire World War II history sometime in one of these videos. But for now, I'm going to wrap this up since I did a video yesterday and this evening. I want to get this up while it's still December 7th, because it won't be for very long, all right? So take care, everyone, and don't ASMR and drive. Next time we'll come back with a more light-hearted topic. Bye-bye.